So yesterday on the main stage in the Disney Lorcana Discord, there was actually a pseudo uh, discussion around the creative concepts of Set 7 Arcasia's Island with the designers of the game. I thought it was pretty interesting on particular cards they hit on, so I wanted to make a quick video just covering those particular cards. And on that, you're going to listen and hear feedback kind of about Ink Geyser, about Sapphire Coil, and also Baymax. Three cards I think are pretty controversial and kind of most likely the most talked about going in, aside from like the shock and awe of seeing characters we hadn't seen before. So I really wanted to take a time, let you hear from Steve and Allison and James their kind of thoughts and opinions on those cards, and then kind of like just give you my thought process of how they answered the question and honestly what I think is really possible with the cards in general. So the question being asked here was about the identity of Duel Links in general and kind of like what the position of Ink Geyser could or could not be within the Disney Lorcana metagame.
We went through and figured out kind of what we wanted mechanically for each of the pairs. And we sort of started to craft around those sorts of things. But then we also wanted to figure out what franchises would fit those pairs and the mechanics that we were hoping to get there. So
So it's kind of interesting how he kind of goes through what Duel Links really wanted to be, and saying like, hey, we knew what the pairs were going to be, obviously, but we had to figure out what mechanics we wanted those pairs to be, and then we had to figure out what uh, IPs were going to be said mechanics. So it really is just like a trickle down effect of how design works. And if you guys haven't watched it yet, I actually did an interview with Steve a few months back talking about Azerite Sea. So it was nice to kind of hear some of these thoughts about the addition of Duel Links and kind of what they're going to do for the game as well.
although Ink Geyser falls out of that, that one was a bit more on the what is something cool that this color pair can do that we would never be able to do outside of this color pair. And that's how we got around to Ink Geyser.
So again, this card is really interesting. It's very clear that you could only play it in Emerald Sapphire, and that's exactly why it was designed for Emerald Sapphire. So while they wanted this card to exist, and they wanted this ability for players to be able to play this type of strategy within Lorcana, it's noting that they don't think this would be acceptable in any other ink combination except for Emerald Sapphire, which is that's a big comment to make.
And so that one we sort of felt like could be an interesting case for a card that if you wanted to kind of slow people down was great, but also if you wanted to get back a bunch of cards from your inkwell because you had been using a lot of those cards that put cards into your inkwell, it could also be advantageous to you. So it's got several different routes of being able to use it, but which one is best will be up to the players to try to figure out.
And I think that's like really the key factor here, right? The idea that we have this new ability, this new card, and it is dramatically different than honestly most cards in Disney Lorcana, and it is set in these boundaries that they're giving us. So they're basically telling you we couldn't do this anywhere else. This is where you're allowed to do it, and this is where we think it's fair. So as players of Disney Lorcana, it's kind of up to us to decide if it is fair or not. It's going to be up to someone to decide to go and break this. And I think that there's a good chance that with a unique ability like this, I don't know if you will ever achieve the level of consistency, and that might just be the whole argument here, is that yes, there are clearly ways to build this deck and do the thing and it be really unfair. But there are also ways to understand that you might brick. You might not even see Ink Geyser. You might not even be able to do the cool trick that you want to do. You may not, have everything line up so you can play a big character and then Ink Geyser, and then it might not happen. And that might be what they're comfortable with so far and what they found in their playtesting in general.
Yeah, this seems like it would have been a fun one in testing for sure.
Yeah, well, I'll let Allison talk about it.
It was a very unique one in testing and had a lot of thoughts on both sides about how to develop this card correctly to make sure that we can give as much of the dream alive to the players to build fun, exciting decks, but will not become too, I'll say, oppressive to the environment.
So, for those of you that don't know, Allison is one of the lead game designers for the game. She's commonly found at the convention events, so Gen Con and PAX Unplugged. I've had the pleasure of having many conversations with Allison. She's brilliant. She's honestly very informative when you ask specific questions that she's allowed to answer. So, her just saying, like, hey, we know what this card is capable of, we understand it, and we do feel comfortable about it. And you're hearing that now from two different designers, and I think that that's really important to note, is that they're very well aware of what this card could be and what it is and everything like that. I think it's important to hear that from multiple facets and things like that. So again, shout out to the dev team for kind of knocking this one out of the park. I think, if we're being honest, this is like the most I don't know, controversial card. You know, maybe not the most controversial, maybe that's Sapphire Coil, but this card, without a doubt, will probably cause the most flip tables. I think it as one of, like, almost as close to what Pete is doing, but more brutal. Mostly because if we talk about A Whole New World, in all honesty, is a really great comparison, which I know is super kind of like what I against what I just said. But the idea that even in Steel Songs decks, or any deck that is focused around playing A Whole New World, generally speaking, your deck is better because you're the deck built to play A Whole New World. Ink Geyser will be very similar. Since you're the deck that are going to build to be the Ink Geyser deck, when you're playing against decks that are not the Ink Geyser deck, they're not just going to be in line to contend with you. And I think that's the biggest part about this card, is that when you can set it up and you can do your thing, you're going to do things that are very unfair, most likely in Disney Lorcana, and it's going to leave your opponent just very angry because, you know, they're playing this fair game. I mean, think about Ruby Amethyst, guys. Like, Ruby Amethyst is just like, ink a card, play a card, ink a card, play a card, ink a card, play a card. Like, their whole game is just like, okay, I gotta survive, I gotta get to like turn 6 and 7 and 8, and then I gotta like fight for the board, and I just like take over and I win the game. Well, if you say on turn 5, okay, I'm gonna set you back 2 more turns, and yes, they're gonna get those cards back in their hand, but the real truth is that most of the cards left in their hand might be uninkables. So you're gonna pick up a couple cards they ink, but they're just going to have to ink them again and then maybe pass. So when you think about having that much control over a particular set of the metagame, that's where I think Ink Geyser might truly excel. And that's why I'm most excited about this card more than any other card in Disney Lorcana.
Baymax.
All the characters.
Yeah, Rochelle's very correct. Opening all the doors here. One of the ideas with Big Hero 6 was that they were very interested in the shift mechanic. And so a lot of the characters either make it easier, give you bonuses. We have some other really cool things in the set. And we wanted to make sure that there was at least a card that would grant you that access to shifting just regardless of who you had in play. And I know that Morph exists from set 2, but we wanted something kind of a little bit easier to get that shift on rather than having something that opened all the shift doors in a different way. So we came up with this Baymax who could shift on any character at all. And we really liked where he ended up. He created a number of decks and is generally just a pretty powerful character. Even if you don't want to go with the rest of the line, he does have a lot of advantages just getting him out early.
So this is a card that everyone was very hyped about. Universal Shift is a mechanic that is brand new. The concept here is that it can just shift onto any character within Disney Lorcana. So when you say, hey, listen, the way this game is going to work, you know, this is cost 4 to shift, and on turn 4, I might be able to play this Baymax on turn 4 pretty consistently. If I TPO on 2, And then on 3, I just get to shift this character in and then immediately, swing, deal 5 damage to something, be in a challenge, gain 2 lore, or my favorite and concept of all is just like on turn 3, we can sing how far I go. Not play it, like we can actually put a character into play with stats and sing a card like how far I'll go or something greater. I mean, that's the kind of the coolest thing for me. So that's what I'm most excited about this card. And I think what Steve does there is a really unique thing of saying like, hey, we understand Morph was in the game, and this is kind of similar, but it's reverse because now all of a sudden any character could open up a shift line. And I do think, again, that it's very particular to this in combination. And while, Big Hero 6 is very clearly the in combination for Emerald Sapphire, and we're going to see that, moving forward is my assumption, but it's one of those that there's no way this card could have been a steel card. There's no way that Universal Shift could exist on a steel card, because that means any steel character left in play could be shift onto and then immediately seeing a whole new world, and it would be oppressive. The idea that it's contained because it's Emerald Sapphire and the songs in Emerald Sapphire aren't like egregious, I think is a really big deal of why this card can be plenty successful and also not feel like ridiculously broken.
Well, it's definitely a challenge. I fully agree. As I said, we had our early kind of issues with our designs and getting things to be fun as well as exciting. But I have an amazing development team. They're very passionate about things. And so when cards like this come up and they also agree that it could be very powerful, there's a lot of testing that goes on with these things. And the final version is definitely not what we started with. But it was one that felt good to play, and we felt like there was enough things that could counter it, but also having it be in a dual color ink right off the bat sort of already tells the opponent early on, like, you might have to be afraid of this. You might have to be ready for it. And so that's one of the other benefits of being dual color, is that the players will generally have a good idea of what the possibilities are. And although he can go on top of anybody, your opponent can plan and be ready.
I think it's interesting that Steve talks about planning in the game, and very often, a shift line is a shift line, and you kind of know about it. There's a Robin Hood in play, you're like, oh, he has Robin Hood, like they can shift in Robin Hood. If they have Zimba, like, oh, they can shift in Zimba. Like, you can see those things. I think the unexpected nature of Baymax is, for the first couple of weeks of set 7 and the Arcasia's Island, as we're kind of like developing that metagame, Baymax is going to be a card that catches a lot of people off guard. And it's also funny to think like, oh, how do I play around this card? Well, does that mean I have to fire the cannons a Tipo? Because generally speaking, that's not a play that most people want to make. It's sometimes a play that you have to make, but it's not necessarily something that you want to do. But does this also open up the ability of like new 2-drops and new 3-drops that have just like a slightly above willpower stat, just to consistently get this guy into play on turn 4? Maybe we don't have to live in a world that is all about Azurite Sea and all about Tipo and just ramping on 2. Like, maybe we can live in a world where we're playing a more steady mid-range game, knowing that on turn 4 we can have cards like Baymax shifting in, doing whatever it's going to do, or Scrooge McDuck doing whatever it's going to do. Like, these cards that can come in. The other thing that's really big about this card to me is that 5 strength is really, really hard to find in Emerald Sapphire. Like, especially for the cost of 4. And again, it's uninkable. So Scrooge McDuck comes to mind, but it's an uninkable thing. You also have to wait a turn, so it's still kind of slow on the draw specifically. Like, even on turn 3 Scrooge on the draw is like, all right, like, I got my Scrooge, it's cool, but you might be so far behind the game already that it's not enough. This card on turn 3 is a way bigger difference. It comes in right away and does a thing. Like, the shift mechanic is so very powerful. So it's interesting to hear from Steve, like, oh, it is future-proofed. And at the end of the day, like, it is what it is, right? Like, the card can't get technically better or worse in theory. There's just more characters that you can put on top of it, but I don't know that the design of any other character realistically gets affected by Baymax. Like, this is just a card that we have to accept is in the game, and can do its thing at any given moment and not really be too concerned about how like insane it is. Again, you're locked into Emerald Sapphire, you're locked into an uninkable in your deck. So I think there's a lot of things like when you pay 6 for this character, it's not very good. Like a 6 cost 5/5 uninkable with 2 lore is an ability that does nothing is not very good at all. So this card's only good when we can shift, and it's not always going to be easy to kind of get away with that. And I think that that's really what Steve was getting at in his comments.
Yeah, and it puts it into a realm of how the game, one of the things that we always try to do is we try to make sure that playing the game actually matters, right? That the game isn't over at the deck building stage. And so there is a lot of thought put into, how do I build my deck for this? But then how in the game do I play it out? And for example, that hero, he can be quite good, but there are a lot of ways to prevent him from having too much impact. And the goal of, if I'm the opponent, right, my goal is to prevent you from really getting that off to higher advantage. And your goal is getting him off to that higher advantage. And so there's that gameplay around it of, do you play a hero so that you can work on shifting him, or do you play something else so that you can try to get whatever I have to counter him out of my hand? And those are all thoughts that actually the dev team really does a lot with, in order to make sure that there's that fun gameplay inside the actual game.
Yeah, the game within a game is always important in any which way, and I think the shift mechanic is like the ultimate game within the game for Disney Lorcana. Sometimes you quest with Robin Hood on 2, and you say, hey, go ahead, if you want to get rid of my Robin Hood, and you think I have the shift line, then you're going to like make the play I want you to do, and you might not even have the Robin Hood. Sometimes you do it because you're gambling, your opponent doesn't want to trade, and they say you don't have it, and then you do. So there's so many like games there that shift lines create, and it 100% does reward good gameplay. So it is one of those like, are you defending or are you the offense in this situation? And that's exactly what Steve was getting at in that comment of just saying, that's why we play the game. That's why it's not all about just deck construction. We do actually have to play and make sure we play to the best of our ability.
I know there was some debate about little a action, big A action.
Yeah, a dingle hopper would not cause an illusion to banish. And I also want to clarify too, because I know that there's a lot of questions around it. If I play an action such as Mother Knows Best, and I choose this card, my action is going to fully resolve before this effect triggers and resolves. So it will actually be back into its opponent's hand, and then the effect won't do anything because it's not in play anymore. So just getting that out there right now.
So it was funny during the main stage. I was watching, obviously, that's why I have the recorded video here. And I did ask that question, can we ask about Mother's Knows Best and how cards like that interact with Vanish? This is a card that obviously is going to be good. It's going to see play. People need to understand all of the different interactions with it. When you start talking about Emerald Sapphire cards being played, well, then you think about the Emerald Sapphire removal. Cards like We Don't Talk About Bruno. Cards like Mother's Knows Best. Like things like that bounce things back to opponents' hands, or You're Welcome. All those cards that come to mind. You have to understand that the way Disney Lorcana mechanics work is that it is action first. Everything in the game works off the card being played to completion. That's how it works. So when you play a song, the song has to be played, and for it to be considered played, it has to be completed. So when you exert and you sing a card like Mother Knows Best to banish or to return a giant cobra to hand, it's not like Vanish immediately happens and all of a sudden you get to banish the card. Not how it works. Really great that Steve was able to say that and have, I think there was like 700 people at least in this room. I'm here to kind of like, again, just put a pin on it. Like, guys, we can't do this. So when you play a card like Mother's Knows Best, card like You're Welcome, the card will go back to their opponent's hand and they will, proceed everything forward. There is no, I'm going to Mother's Knows Best your card and it gets banished because it has banished. No, that's not how it works. That's not how the game works. That's not how Disney Lorcana works. So I was really glad that I was able to sneak that question in there, and Steve kind of see it and answer it, because I think it's important for everyone to understand that particular mechanic of Disney Lorcana. And I quote, "Game dev, you need to answer for this card." That was literally the lead up into the reveal here of the Sapphire Coil on the main stage, and giving the game devs their opportunity to talk about this card. And I think it's very fair, everything that Steve's about to say. So let's take a listen to it and give it a real chance to understand where they're coming from as game designers.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things going on with this card. It'll be interesting to see how it goes, and we will always keep our eyes on how environments play out. We understand that it's very powerful, and I think that being at a 2 cost here is a lot different than the ice blocks that people are used to, because 2 cost is at a spot where Sapphire decks want to do a lot of other things as well. So it's got some differences. And if you've ever had a case where you're running low on cards, putting a card into your inkwell when you have 13 of them already is not always your favorite choice. So there's a lot of play differences between this and ice block, and we wanted to provide at least a card that you could choose instead of ice block. You could try to run it in addition to ice block and have lots of cards that provided this effect. I will say that this is another one that went through quite a bit of testing, so I think that there will be a lot to find out on this card as people go forward.
I really didn't like this card went through quite a bit of testing line at the end there. I'm under the assumption that every card goes through quite a bit of testing. So when they say, something might have been favored more than another, obviously it means, in my opinion, that this is obviously created to affect the, particular metagame. Not all vanillas need to be tested like strenuously. They are what they are. Most of the time they are just a tribute to the community of saying, hey, we got this character into the game and things like that. But when you go out of your way to say, oh, this card got more testing, I'm fearful of the world where the backlash could be even greater. When you make those statements and you say, hey, this is it, we feel great about it, we don't think it's going to be a problem because we did X. It's not a line that I like to toe too much. It is interesting to hear, the difference of Sapphire decks like to do X. Well, in all honesty, I very commonly talk about this all the time. Some of the most successful decks recently in Lorcana are redefined versions of what players assumed. With the creation of Dig Dug, with the creation of the new Ruby Sapphire deck, the DKP just won with the creation of the version of Ruby Amethyst that Ed won with. Like, all of these decks came with a new concept in mind. A few months ago, we talked about a Ruby Amethyst deck that made a top 8 of a large tournament that didn't play goats. Like, just because the natural flow of things tells us, oh, on 2 we have to TPO, or on 2 we have to sail. Like, that's not always true. Yeah, of course it's great to accelerate your game state, but if you told me that there's a way to play this card where just on turn 2 this is my play, and then on turns 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 I'm gonna put a card into my inkwell and gain a bonus from this in some way, whether it's Brawl, whether it's Sisu, whether it's through challenging with my Grandma Talas, whether it's through bigger Sisu, like, whatever it is, there are ways to utilize this card to the fullest. Even for Emerald, like with Muses and things like that. Like, there are lots of other ways to interact with this card that make it so maybe we don't need, to ink. Maybe we just don't need to TPO. Maybe we don't need to Salarize Right Sea. Heck, honestly, maybe we want to put Sapphire Coil in play so when we play TPO, we can give something -4. Like, now TPO and Salarize Right Sea might be better cards later in the game to take away more problematic characters. If later in the game we're able to get away with the Salarize Right Sea and put 2 cards in Rankwell, and then all of a sudden make a Maui Shark from 7 strength to 3 strength and play Medusa, I mean, that's a play that shouldn't exist, you know? So that to me is a bit fearful of a comment to say, like, this is how we tested this card, this is what Sapphire likes to do. I'm very much like, hey, when you present new cards, we're here to break them. And if we learn very quickly that, well, we just don't sail on 2 anymore, or in certain matchups, we just don't sail anymore. Like, we just don't Tebow anymore. Like, we just ink them. And then we just get the effect from Sapphire Coil for 4 or 5 turns straight. And if you tell me that I can get use out of a Sapphire Coil, honestly, 3 times in a game is probably already insane for literally just inking a card. That's where I get a little bit hesitant. That's where I a little bit get scared. So it's nice, and I'm going to let Steve continue and break down the card further here. But that was my initial reaction while listening to Steve kind of discuss Sapphire Coil to start. But let's hear the other part here.
Yeah, and like I said, we'll always be keeping an eye on the environments and things like that. And as I think that the players have seen in the past, we are willing to make adjustments when we feel like we have made a mistake. And so, this is something that we'll keep an eye on. But I feel like right now it'll be interesting to see what people do with it and how things play out with everything. And keep in mind that there's a whole new set of cards that they will also get to be playing. So I know that it slots right into a couple decks, but there's a lot more decks out there now.
So I really like the comment of, hey, if we messed up, we messed up. And that's good. I think that that's important. Obviously, we've already seen it before in the past with Bucky. The other day, Bucky called an errata. It was not fun for the game. People really liked having cards in their hand. Sapphire Coil is not the idea of discarding every turn, but it is the idea that if it does create those lines I was just talking about where, Sapphire Coil on 2, on turn 3, CC your guy, on turn 4, brawl your guy, on turn 5, make my, Sisu into whatever. Like, all of those things having this potential to consistently remove cards could lead to really negative play experience or really negative new player experience where players just don't even feel like they get to play the game because everything they do just gets answered so freely. So it's nice to know that Ravensburger and the dev team are prepared that if it gets to that point and if it looks like it's not fun, then they're already prepared to make a change to this card. And I think that that's nice. I think that's a good thing to hear that because it's not something they talk about too often where they talk about Bucky and how Bucky was removed. And it's great to know hey, just because something happened once, it doesn't mean it can't happen again. It doesn't mean that we're perfect. We can make mistakes. We're human. We only have so much time on a particular set and a particular card. So with that I think is really great. And then the secondary comment of, we're talking about there's 203 other cards in this set. There's a lot of new things to explore. There's a lot of new decks that can come out that can be good into Sapphire Coil. At the end of the day, it is a 2-cost item, and there are plenty of cards that are playable that just banish items. So when you put all those things into mind, it's very easy to react to Sapphire Coil in the way the community did. I obviously think this card is very good. There is no question whatsoever that Sapphire Coil is a good card. Is it meta-defining? Yeah, I think it will be. I think if you ask me week 1, what are people going to be doing? They're probably going to put Sapphire Coil into the Ruby Sapphire decks, and they're probably going to make people miserable. I think that's obvious. So, it is one of those where because it's so good, because it's so prominent, because it already fits in arguably, one of the best decks in the current metagame, it's very easy to just transition in right into it in set 7. If you're already a Ruby Sapphire player and you're already a Ruby Sapphire fan, I mean, you're just yippee, I'm going to just kill everyone in week 1. So I do agree to that. And that's the biggest problem is that it's really going to say if week 1, Sapphire decks are at an all-time high because specifically of Sapphire Coil and Emerald decks figured out how to really break it with Under the Sea and with muses and stuff like that, and Ruby decks are just running amok with Sisus and Brawls, um, maybe we see it. But if we go through a month of it, and let's say we get to set championships and it's not as prominent, more people have added, the right cards to their deck, and I think that you'll start to see a shift. If that doesn't happen, or if it does happen and it still like isn't enough, then I expect that this card will probably, at least get a real conversation around what can be done with a card like this. And, is it just a ban, which they didn't get before, but could it be now? If they were to eroded it, what would they eroded it to? Like, things like that are the conversations, but we're not there yet. I'm definitely not there yet. I think this card is obviously good, but I'm not like ready to say, oh my god, it needs to be banned before we ever open a pack of Arcasia's Island. I think that's a little ridiculous.
In terms of balancing it, how do you adjust to say, okay, this is different enough that it still makes sense to make it a new card?
So with that one, I think that there's a combination. One, so it's a two-part question here. So the first part is the design of it. And there's always going to be some amount of overlap of abilities because we are doing new sets every 3 months. We have a lot of cards that go into those sets. And we also have very specific color mechanics that are built into those colors. And we want to make sure that that feeling of the color mechanics is felt because that's what sort of helps determine how those play out in the game. And then the second part of that is the development aspect of things. So being able to test all these things, make sure that they aren't broken, that they aren't causing despair with the players, and that they're actually fun and exciting is, a chore of passion, right? Like, again, I have a great development team and they work very hard to go through all of the cards. And every time we change a card, it causes them to have to go and retest all of the cards because you never know what happens. And so with that in mind, with something like this, from a design perspective, our feeling was that this card actually isn't as close as what people think because it's got a different cost. It's got a different way to trigger the effect. It's got a fairly different amount of uses for it, and it's got different weaknesses as well. So from our point of view, it's close in the way of cost, but it is different. And the effect is close and similar, but that's within that color. From a development point of view, we felt like because these things played a bit differently, there was always that sort of debate that you could have of which one should I play? Or you could go all in and try to play both of them and see how that works. And between all of that and all of the feedback and all of the discussions, we get to the point of where we feel the card should be, and then that's how the card gets to the players. So it's a lot of discussion, a lot of work, a lot of games that all go into every single card that comes out. And we're human. I'm not going to say that we're not going to miss some things, but we are very hopeful when we put out cards that they're not going to be missed. So I hope that answered the question. I feel like I kind of gave a full rundown of how design and development run.
So yeah, Steve there answering the question, kind of like both sides of the coin when it comes to developing a card, between the development and the design, and how you get there and how you craft it. I think Steve answers great. The idea that, listen, this card maybe it changed 100 times. It's certainly possible that this card could change 100 times. It could change at 9 a.m. and then at 12 p.m. and then at 3 p.m. and then at 4 p.m. it might go back to what it started at 9 a.m. Like that's the rotation of things that could happen, and that's kind of how you do create a position to where you're pretty comfortable when you release a card that it is what it is, and that that it's good. The design team is not what it once was. Before it was a couple guys just doing it together with very little help and super private rooms, and I'm sure that had to sign ridiculous NDAs about playing paper cards or some crap, right? they're not that anymore. You know, Ravensburger is big. They just moved into a new office. Like, the team is growing. They just hired, a brand new player. Like, they just hired Candio. Like, clearly they have moved so far past where they were in sets 1 and sets 2. So when you start talking about designing set 7, you're talking about a team of much more people, much more reach, and, probably a general understanding that I have to imagine that they go through before a set is sent to an ink, right? Before it's sent to the ink, before it's sent to a printer, they likely have some meeting, and this meeting is probably an all-day thing, and they go through every card one by one, and they have a pros and cons list of what can be changed, what cannot be changed. That's my humble guess. Do I know? I don't know for sure, but that is my assumption of what is going to happen before a set comes out. So when Steve says, we monitor this, we played different versions of this, we got to the point that this is a different enough card from previous cards, and it's an impactful in a different way, it has pros in a different way, it has cons in a different way, and it all balances out, and it's going to be fine. Well, we have to take that for what it's worth. Again, as players, it's our job to break things. It is their job to try and prevent us to break things, but, there are thousands upon thousands of players and only tens of game designers and playtesters, probably. So, obviously, if this is one of those cards that comes out and it is just unbelievably detrimental to the game, I have to believe that Ravensburger will correct itself. But to this point, Bucky was really only removed because of negative play experience, not necessarily because it was that objectively overpowered or gruesome, but it was the overall experience of the game that Bucky led to. In some games, Bucky just said your opponent doesn't get to play the game, and on turn 4, they don't have any cards in their hand, and it's just an awful feeling all around. Sapphire Coil might not do that, but I mentioned this a little bit earlier where, if you play a game and you sit down on a league night with a new player that's just learning the game, and you go Sapphire Coil on 2, and then on turn 3, you banish their guy, turn 4, you banish their guy, turn 5, you banish their guy. Like, if all of that is happening because of Sapphire Coil, it'll be very, very frustrating for them. And at the next level of that, we've lived in a world where, okay, I play Smee on 2, this card can't get brawled. It can't be Sisu'd. Well, if they go Sapphire Coil on 2, and then on turn 3 they ink, make your Smee a 1 strength, and then banish it with either Brawl or Sisu, you're like, all right, well, that sucks, but it's okay. I can kind of move the game forward. I'll play Lawrence. And then, they ink, and then they Brawl your Lawrence. You're like, all right, what's going on? I can't... These cards that were designed to be better into these things aren't no longer, they're no longer reliable. Do I have to just play an Ald Ward deck? I don't know. Maybe that is the level that we're going to get to. You're just going to have to play cards with Ward, and you're going to have to completely forget this card exists, or you're going to have to find a way to go over the top and have a better end game to them, which is very difficult. So right now, everything is pointing to this card looking like a, potentially the best card in the set, if I'm being completely honest. There's more cards that are flashy, more cards that are interesting, more cards that people really want to build for, but in terms of power and just so easily being inserted into what is potentially the best deck already, I think it leads to a lot of concern, and I think it's fair. I think it's warranted, and I think it's very, very fair for the community to be anxious. But all in all, I hope you guys kind of like this type of video. I really wanted to react to the comments made by Steve and the rest of the team about these cards that, upon being released, social media kind of blew up for all of them for all different reasons. And I think it's important to say, hey, we had the opportunity to hear firsthand from them. If you were there on the main stage, awesome, you kind of got everything out of this. If you weren't, hopefully this was enough. To me, these were the most impactful cards that were discussed and talked about. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you do enjoy content like this, definitely hit the like button. Let me know in the comments how you feel about these cards. Do you think they're going to ruin the game? Do you think everyone's overreacting? Just let me know, because it'll make me kind of give me an idea of if you guys like this type of content more, and then I continue to make more things like this. But all in all, this was a blast. Thanks again for everyone on the main stage asking questions. Artabax, Kawa, Caroline, you guys were awesome. And of course, shout out to Steve, Ali, and James for kind of participating as well, being a part of that conversation. And of course, Rochelle for kind of being the instructor of all of it and keeping it moving forward. I think the whole thing was an hour-ish, like maybe an hour and 5 minutes. It wasn't too bad. So nice to see everything go clean slate. But all in all, again, thank you guys so much for watching today. I'll catch you the next one.